Hi class, in this recording we're going to talk about how synovial joints can move. And there's a little bit on this topic, so we broke it up into two separate recordings, I should say. Now when we look at the movement of joints, we need a vocabulary for the joint movement. And this vocabulary allows for us to effectively communicate the kinds of movements we're seeing. For those of you that are taking this class and are kinesiology majors, you're going to eat this up. You've already had this in a lot more detail in your kinesiology specific courses. So as we look at these terms, it's kind of like the directional terminology of the body where we have anterior and posterior, superior, inferior, proximal, distal. We have terms presented in pairs with opposite meanings. So when you are learning this, group these opposite terms with each other. You also need to understand anatomical planes and directional terms. So if you need to review that, please go back and review the chapter 1 recordings where we covered all of those directional terms and those plane terminology. Actually, I want to say directional terms were in chapter 1 and Atlas A recordings for this particular textbook we're using. Now the zero position, we need to define the zero position. This is when a person is in standard anatomical position. So the joints are all at 0 degrees of flexion or extension or movement. Any deviation, any movement away from standard anatomical position is described as a movement, or returning to anatomical position is described as a movement. So when we're standing in anatomical position, we're at the zero position, and any other movements associated away from or towards anatomical position is a movement. And I know, we just defined what moving is. I know, it's kind of goofy. So let's start off with some easier ones. We have a monoaxial joint right here, one of my favorites, the elbow. And when we have the zero position, the elbow is straight. We have our elbow hanging down, with our hands hanging down, palm forward, think of anatomical position. Flexion is going to be reducing the joint angle. So if I'll use red here. If I was to assume green is my pivot point or my fulcrum, I can have a joint angle between the two bones of my joint. I'm having a little bit of the levers of my joint. There we go. And then in blue, I just drew an angle. So if I make that angle smaller, I am flexing. And if I make this angle larger, I am extending the joint. And then based on our zero position, if I can extend the joint or flex the joint beyond the zero position, so refer back to anatomical positioning, that's going to be hyperextension and or hyperflexion. A classic example is the wrist. So we can have the wrist at rest. Here's our zero position for our wrist. And if I bring the wrist back, that's hyperextension. Hyperextension doesn't occur at all diarthroses or all synovial joints. It occurs at just a very few of our joints, naturally, unless you're double jointed or have elongated ligaments. Ugh. It gives me the EBGBs when I see people do that, like my kids. As we look at flexion and extension at other joints, here we can have the shoulder. I need to shift colors here to red so you can see what I'm doodling better. So here we have the shoulder. Flexion of the shoulder is going to be raising the arm up in front of you, straight in front of you. Extension is going to be lowering the arm to, resting at your side at the zero position. And then hyperextension, which is something I am losing the ability to do, is when you raise your arm straight behind you. We also can have that with the hip and the knee. So if we look at the hip, our hip is right here. Hip flexion is raising up the knee. And then if we look at the knee, let me shift to green here for our knee. So here we have a knee joint. And if I pull my knee up this direction, that is flexion of the knee. So this woman in this picture is flexing her hip and flexing her knee all at the same time. And then to extend both of them, if she were to just take her foot and put it back down to the ground, she would extend the hip and extend the knee at the same time. Man, this presentation goes a lot faster in person because I can actually wiggle in front of in front of the class, as opposed to doodling on the screen. Let's talk about abduction and adduction. First, as a disclaimer, I want to acknowledge the fact, let's acknowledge the elephant in the room. Abduction and adduction sound way too similar to each other. It's confusing how similar these terms are to each other. So I usually, when I'm talking to students in a laboratory setting, in an in-person lab, I'll say abduction versus adduction, just to really emphasize the differences between these very similar sounding words. So abduction is when you are going to have movement away from the midline of the body. So here we have the midline of the body for this young lady, right down the middle there. And if she raises her arms up and away, that is abduction of the arms, or we could have abduction of the legs. I always like to think of how if you're being abducted by aliens, you are being lifted up into the air and carried away. And if you're abducting your arms, you are raising your hands up into the air. We also can have hyperabduction. Hyperabduction is when we are going to take our arm and raise it over the back or the front of our head. So abduction would be up into the 90-degree angle. Hyperabduction is when we go above our head. Occasionally, we can even have hyperabduction of the legs. You probably have seen young kids do this, where they pick up their feet and put their feet behind their heads. Oh. We also can have adduction, adduction. And when I look at this D, I like to think of D for down. So if I bring my hands down towards the midline of the body, so again, here's the midline right down the middle. If we go down towards the midline, that's adduction, D for down. We also have elevation and depression. With our shoulders to elevate, we go up. To depress, we go down. That's really straightforward. We also can have, as we're looking at this, protraction and retraction. To protract our shoulders, and full disclosure, I spend way too much of my life in a protracted position with bad posture, and I have nerve impingement because of that. Protracting is when you slouch your shoulders forward, and then retraction is when you bring them back and puff your chest out. When we look at circumduction, this one's a little bit more interesting. Circumduction is when you can take an appendage and one end of the appendage will remain stationary. This is usually going to be the proximal end, or the end that's closer to the attachment point. So right there's our proximal end that's stationary, and the other end of the appendage spins in a wide, broad circle. So that's circumduction. So you can spin your arm in a circle as an example of that. We also can have rotation. So as we look at rotation, rotation of a joint is when we spin a bone on its long, lengthwise, or longitudinal axis. So here we have a humerus in this woman's upper arm, and she's spinning the humerus along its longitudinal axis. That's rotation. And here we have in her thigh, there's the femur, and here she's spinning her femur along the longitudinal axis. And there's different kinds of rotation. We have medial rotation and lateral rotation, known as internal and external rotation. We can also have supination and pronation. Supination and pronation are movements that are typically going to be used to describe the forearm. So to pronate the forearm is to be a movement that's going to be turning the palm to face either posteriorly or downward, depending on if you're in an anatomical position standing up or lying down. So another way to think of this is you're turning your forearm so that your palm is pointing towards your butt. And during this process, this pronation process, if we want to be technical about it, the pronation process is turning the forearm so that the radius and ulna crisscross with each other. So turning it in such a way to make the radius and ulna crisscross is pronation. And then on the flip side, supination is the opposite. So if you turn your forearm so that your palm is facing the front of your body or the anterior of your thigh, that is supination, or to turn your arm in such a way so that the radius and ulna are no longer crisscrossing with each other, that is supination. We want the radius and ulna to be parallel with each other. That's all we have for this recording. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the class discussion board or to shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.